When Rita Keller took 9 hits to her body during a routine patrol in Eastern Europe, everyone assumed she was finished. But instead of falling, she did something that defied every law of human endurance. She carried 3 wounded soldiers on her back across 2 miles of hostile territory to safety. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how the woman they called too emotional became the most decorated soldier in her unit's history. The morning briefing at Firebase Artemis began at 0530, but Rita Keller had been awake since 0300. She sat in the corner of the mess hall, methodically cleaning her sidearm while reviewing patrol routes on a tablet that she'd bought with her own money. At 22, Rita stood 5 feet 4 inches with auburn hair that she kept regulation short and green eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around her. Rita had been stationed at this remote outpost in the Carpathian Mountains for 7 months, serving as a communications specialist with the 4th European Defense Battalion. The base was a collection of prefabricated buildings and defensive positions carved into the mountainside, designed to monitor cross-border activities in a region where old tensions still simmered beneath the surface of political treaties. Her fellow soldiers had mixed feelings about Rita Keller. On one hand, she was undeniably competent at her job. Her communications equipment was always perfectly maintained. Her message logs were flawless, and she could establish radio contact in conditions that left other operators frustrated and defeated. She spoke 4 languages fluently and had an uncanny ability to interpret coded transmissions that others struggled to decode. But Rita had what her commanding officers politely termed emotional intensity. She became upset when soldiers were injured. She argued passionately during tactical discussions. She visibly struggled with the moral complexities of their mission in ways that made career military personnel uncomfortable. In a profession that valued stoic composure, Rita Keller wore her heart on her sleeve. "She's too soft for this work," Staff Sergeant Mueller had confided to his drinking buddies after a particularly heated discussion about civilian evacuation protocols. "Good with the radios, sure, but when things get real, you need someone who can keep their emotions in check." What Mueller and others didn't know was that Rita's emotional nature came with an incredible capacity for empathy and situational awareness. While other soldiers focused on their immediate tactical responsibilities, Rita noticed everything: the stress levels of her teammates, the subtle changes in local civilian behavior, the patterns in hostile communications that suggested larger strategic movements. She'd grown up in a small village in Austria where her father worked as a mountain rescue coordinator. From the age of 10, Rita had accompanied him on training exercises, learning to navigate treacherous terrain and think clearly under pressure. Her childhood was filled with stories of ordinary people who performed extraordinary rescues, who refused to abandon others regardless of personal risk. The decision to join the military hadn't been easy for someone with Rita's temperament. She'd considered becoming a doctor or a social worker, careers that seemed more aligned with her nurturing instincts. But the increasing instability in Eastern Europe had convinced her that she could make a difference as a soldier, that her combination of technical skills and human insight might be valuable in ways that others couldn't appreciate. Rita's quarters were spartanly furnished except for a small collection of books on tactical medicine and emergency response. Every evening after her official duties ended, she studied field surgery techniques, memorized the symptoms of combat trauma, and practiced emergency evacuation procedures. She'd quietly earned several certifications in battlefield medicine, using her leave time to attend courses that her superiors considered unnecessary for a communications specialist. Her preparations weren't random. Rita had noticed that Firebase Artemis was located in terrain that would make conventional medical evacuation extremely difficult during combat situations. The nearest hospital was 50 kilometers away through mountain passes that could be easily blocked by opposing forces. If soldiers were seriously wounded during operations, their survival might depend on someone with both the medical knowledge and the physical capability to get them to safety. As she finished cleaning her weapon that morning, Rita reviewed the patrol schedule on her tablet. Bravo Squad was scheduled for a routine reconnaissance mission to investigate reports of unusual activity near the border crossing at Kozlov Pass. The mission briefing described it as low risk, a simple observation and reporting assignment that should be completed within 6 hours. Rita noticed something in the intelligence reports that troubled her. The unusual activity matched patterns she'd observed in intercepted communications over the past week. There were subtle indicators suggesting that what appeared to be random civilian movement might actually be coordinated preparation for something larger. She'd tried to share these concerns with her superiors, but they'd been dismissed as overthinking by someone too emotional to maintain proper analytical objectivity. She closed the tablet and holstered her sidearm, then walked toward the communications center to begin her shift. The sun was beginning to rise over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and golds. It promised to be a beautiful day, clear and warm with excellent visibility. Rita had no way of knowing that before the sun set, she would be fighting for her life and the lives of 3 soldiers who would owe their survival to the woman everyone considered too emotional to handle real combat. The explosion that saved 12 lives started with a 23-year-old Norwegian barista, who everyone thought was too emotional for real work. But when Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Morrison tossed Selma Bakke his breach charges in the middle of a terrorist crisis, he bet everything on a hunch that the quiet girl who memorized blast patterns while serving espresso might be the only person who could get them through a locked door. Before time ran out, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Joint Task Force Aegis's mess hall in Stavanger, Norway, casting golden light across tables where the world's most elite military personnel gathered for their daily briefings. Selma Bakke stood behind the espresso machine, her delicate hands working with practiced precision as she crafted the perfect cappuccino for a German explosives expert who barely acknowledged her existence. At 23, Selma possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that made people underestimate her immediately. Her platinum blonde hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her bright blue eyes seemed to tear up at the slightest provocation, a trait that had earned her the dismissive nickname Waterworks among some of the rougher soldiers. She spoke in a soft melodic accent that made even her most confident statements sound like questions, and she had a habit of apologizing for things that weren't her fault. "I'm sorry, did you want extra foam?" she asked the explosives expert, her voice barely audible over the morning chatter. He grunted and walked away without answering, leaving Selma to wonder if she'd somehow offended him. What none of them knew was that Selma Bakke had graduated summa cum laude from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology with a degree in applied physics, specializing in controlled demolitions and structural engineering. Her thesis on precision blast patterns in urban environments had been quietly classified by the Norwegian government after her professors realized its potential military applications. She'd taken the job at JTF Aegis not because she couldn't find better work, but because she wanted to be close to real-world applications of her theoretical knowledge. Every day, she served coffee to some of the world's most skilled operatives while secretly absorbing every conversation about mission parameters, blast calculations, and tactical demolitions. "Selma," called Master Sergeant Rodriguez from across the mess hall, "we need 3 more coffees for the briefing room. And make sure they're strong, we've got a long day ahead." "Of course, Sergeant Rodriguez," Selma replied, immediately beginning to work. She'd learned early that being helpful and invisible was the safest way to navigate this environment. The Joint Task Force combined elite units from 12 different nations, and the testosterone-heavy atmosphere didn't leave much room for sensitive Norwegian girls who cried when people raised their voices. As she prepared the coffees, Selma listened to fragments of conversation from nearby tables. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the legendary Navy SEAL they called Reaper, was discussing shape charge calculations with his team. She noticed immediately that his math was slightly off. The blast radius he was planning would create structural weaknesses 3 meters to the left of his intended target, potentially compromising the entire operation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Selma's hands trembled as she considered speaking up. She'd tried to offer technical suggestions before, only to be met with patronizing smiles and gentle dismissals. "Leave the big thinking to us, sweetheart," was a phrase she'd heard more times than she could count. Instead, she focused on perfecting the coffee presentation, arranging the cups on a tray with military precision. Her father had been a demolitions engineer for the Norwegian armed forces, and she'd grown up understanding that in high-stakes situations, every detail mattered. Even something as simple as coffee service could affect the outcome of a mission, if it distracted or energized the right people at the right moment. "Selma, you're doing it again," said Anna Peterson, the only other woman working in the mess hall. Anna was in her 50s, a practical woman who'd been serving military personnel for over 2 decades. "You're overthinking coffee service. They're just soldiers, not royalty." "I know," Selma whispered, her eyes already beginning to water. "I just want to do a good job." Anna softened, recognizing the familiar signs of Selma's emotional nature. "You do excellent work, dear. But maybe try not to care so much about what they think. Half of them can barely tie their own boots without instructions." Selma nodded and carried the coffee tray toward the briefing room, passing groups of operators who spoke in hushed tones about classified missions. She moved like a ghost through their world, present but unnoticed, useful but unimportant. What they saw was a fragile girl who served coffee and cried easily. What they missed was a brilliant mind that had been preparing for this moment her entire life, even if she didn't know it yet. As she set down the coffee cups, Selma caught another fragment of Lieutenant Commander Morrison's conversation about blast patterns. This time, she bit her lip to keep from correcting his calculations, tasting blood as she retreated to the safety of her espresso machine, where she belonged. The Joint Task Force Aegis facility buzzed with the controlled chaos of international military cooperation. Representatives from Navy SEALs, British SAS, German GSG-9, Norwegian FSK, and 8 other elite units worked together on counterterrorism operations across Scandinavia. It was a testosterone-fueled environment where respect was earned through demonstrated tactical expertise and physical prowess, 2 things that Selma's quiet demeanor and emotional nature seemed to disqualify her from possessing. Captain Eric Anderson, the Norwegian liaison officer, embodied the facility's culture perfectly. A former FSK operator with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could carry across a battlefield, he treated Selma with the benevolent condescension typically reserved for beloved pets or elderly relatives. "Selma, sweetheart," he said during the morning briefing preparation, "could you make sure we have extra sugar packets today? Some of our German friends like their coffee sweet." He spoke to her the way one might address a child, his tone warm but fundamentally dismissive. "Of course, Captain Anderson," Selma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. What she didn't say was that she'd already calculated the optimal caffeine-to-sugar ratios for maintaining alertness during extended tactical operations, and had prepared accordingly. The morning briefing focused on a new threat assessment. A terrorist cell operating out of Bergen had acquired military-grade explosives and was planning an attack on the city's historic Bryggen district during the upcoming cultural festival. The operational timeline was tight. They had 72 hours to locate and neutralize the threat before thousands of innocent civilians would be at risk. "Lieutenant," Commander Morrison stood at the front of the briefing room, his presence commanding immediate attention. At 35, he was a legend in special operations circles, known for successful missions in places that didn't officially exist. His team respected him not just for his tactical brilliance, but for his ability to see potential in unconventional places. The target building is a converted warehouse with reinforced concrete walls, Morrison explained, pointing to architectural diagrams on the overhead display. Standard breach protocols won't work here. We need precise calculations for shaped charges that can create entry points without bringing down the entire structure. Selma, refilling coffee cups at the back of the room, noticed immediately that the architectural plans were incomplete. The building had been retrofitted in 2019 with additional steel reinforcement beams, information that was publicly available through Bergen's building permit database, but apparently unknown to the intelligence team. The planned breach points would hit solid steel, rendering the shaped charges ineffective. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again as Captain Anderson shot her a warning look. "Selma, perhaps you could prepare lunch preparations while we finish our tactical discussion," he suggested with a patronizing smile. "I'm sorry," Selma whispered, gathering her coffee service and retreating toward the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Morrison's team continuing their planning based on incomplete information, heading toward a mission failure that could cost lives. Later that afternoon, Selma was restocking supplies when she overheard Sergeant First Class Williams discussing the mission with his British SAS counterpart. "The girl's sweet," Williams was saying, "but she gets emotional about everything. Last week, she cried because someone left their coffee cup on a table instead of bringing it back to the kitchen. Can you imagine her in a real crisis situation? Probably faint at the first sign of trouble," the SAS operative replied with a laugh. "Good thing she's found her proper place. Making coffee is probably exactly challenging enough for someone like her." The words stung more than Selma expected. She'd heard similar comments dozens of times, but they never got easier. What made it worse was that part of her wondered if they were right. She did cry easily, she did get overwhelmed by confrontation, and she had never been tested in a real crisis situation. Maybe her physics degree and theoretical knowledge meant nothing if she couldn't handle the emotional pressure of actual operations. That evening, alone in her small apartment overlooking Stavanger's harbor, Selma sat at her desk surrounded by technical manuals and classified research papers that she'd been studying in her spare time. Her father's old demolitions textbooks were stacked beside cutting-edge journals on explosive engineering, creating a library that would have impressed most military engineers. She pulled up the Bergen building permits database on her laptop and confirmed her suspicions about the warehouse reinforcement. Then she calculated the precise placement and charges needed to breach the updated structure. The solution required a completely different approach, a combination of linear-shaped charges and thermal lances that would need to be deployed simultaneously from 3 different angles. Selma typed up her calculations, complete with diagrams and material specifications, then stared at the document for 20 minutes before deleting it. Who was she to second-guess Lieutenant Commander Morrison? She was just the coffee girl, the emotional Norwegian who cried when people spoke too loudly. Instead, she closed her laptop and prepared for another day of being invisible, helpful, and utterly underestimated. Tomorrow there would be more coffee to make, more tactical discussions to overhear, and more opportunities to prove that sometimes the most important expertise comes from the most unexpected sources. But first, she had to find the courage to speak up, and for someone who apologized for existing, that might be the most dangerous mission of all. Selma's alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., the same time it had every morning for the past 8 months. While the elite operative slept, she used these quiet hours to transform herself from coffee server into something more dangerous, a student of controlled destruction. Her apartment's spare bedroom had been converted into what could only be described as a demolitions laboratory. Technical manuals in 6 different languages lined the walls, their pages marked with sticky notes and calculations written in Selma's precise handwriting. A computer setup that would make most universities envious hummed quietly in the corner, running blast simulation software that she'd acquired through her university contacts. This morning, like every morning, Selma reviewed the previous day's overheard conversations and ran calculations based on the tactical problems she'd witnessed. The Bergen warehouse mission was still 3 days away, but she'd already modeled 17 different breach scenarios, each one accounting for variables that the official planning seemed to have missed. She pulled up her latest simulation on the main monitor. The 3D model of the warehouse rotated slowly, color-coded to show stress points, blast vectors, and structural vulnerabilities. Her analysis confirmed what she'd suspected. The current plan would fail catastrophically. Not only would the shaped charges fail to breach the reinforced sections, but they would likely cause a partial collapse that could trap both the terrorists and any hostages inside. Selma saved her work to an encrypted drive, then deleted all traces from her computer's memory. She'd learned to be careful after the incident 3 months ago when Captain Anderson had noticed her reading an advanced explosives manual during her lunch break. Heavy reading for someone in food service. He'd commented with his typical patronizing smile. Maybe try something lighter. I hear romance novels are popular with young ladies. She'd laughed and claimed it was for a correspondence course, but noticed that he'd started paying more attention to her activities afterward. The last thing she needed was to be transferred to a different position where she couldn't observe and learn from real military operations. At 5:45 a.m., Selma arrived at the JTF Aegis facility and began her coffee preparation routine. The industrial espresso machine was her cover, but also her listening post. From behind the stainless steel equipment, she could hear conversations from across the mess hall while appearing to focus entirely on her work. "Morning, Selma," called Lieutenant Sarah Chun, one of the few people who treated her like an actual human being rather than animated furniture. Chun was a military intelligence analyst from the U.S. Army, and she'd always been kind to Selma without the condescension that marked most interactions. "Good morning, Lieutenant Chun," Selma replied, automatically beginning to prepare Chun's usual order, a double espresso with a splash of oat milk. "How are the preparations going for the Bergen operation?" Chun glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard, then leaned closer. "Between you and me, I'm worried. The intelligence package feels incomplete, and some of the technical assessments don't add up. But when I raised concerns, I was told that the explosives team knows what they're doing." Selma's hands trembled slightly as she worked the espresso machine. This was exactly what she'd feared. Professional military analysts were seeing the same problems she'd identified, but the operational momentum was too strong to allow for course corrections. "I'm sure they'll figure it out," Selma said quietly, hating herself for the diplomatic non-answer. What she wanted to say was that the entire plan was based on faulty premises and needed to be completely reconsidered. What she actually said was, "Would you like an extra shot in your espresso today?" Later that morning, during the daily tactical briefing, Selma noticed something that made her blood run cold. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was reviewing the final breach calculations with his team, and the numbers were even worse than she'd realized. Not only were they planning to breach reinforced sections, but they'd miscalculated the explosive ratios for the building's concrete composition. Bergen's coastal location meant that all construction concrete was mixed with additional salt-resistant additives that changed its blast characteristics. The shaped charges they were planning to use would be 30% less effective than standard calculations predicted. Combined with the steel reinforcement they didn't know about, the mission was heading toward complete failure. Selma carefully approached the serving table where Morrison's team was working, ostensibly to refill their coffee cups. As she leaned over to collect empty cups, she noticed that Morrison's technical specifications was spread out on the table next to his notepad. "Excuse me," she whispered, barely audible over the general conversation. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I noticed ... She trailed off as Morrison looked up at her with mild irritation. "Yes?" he said, not unkindly but clearly busy. Selma's courage evaporated under his direct gaze. I just wanted to refill your coffee, sir. I'm sorry for disturbing you." Morrison nodded and returned to his calculations, missing what might have been the most important technical consultation of his career. Selma retreated to her coffee station, her heart pounding with frustration at her own cowardice. That afternoon, Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached her with a concerned expression. "Selma, we need to talk," he said, his voice unusually serious. "Some of the officers have noticed that you seem very interested in operational discussions. More interested than someone in your position probably should be." Selma felt her face flush with embarrassment and fear. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Rodriguez. I don't mean to eavesdrop. I just ... I try to do my job well, and sometimes I overhear things." "I know you're a smart girl," Rodriguez continued, "but smart can be dangerous in the wrong context. People are starting to ask questions about why the coffee server knows so much about tactical operations. It might be better if you focused more on the coffee and less on the conversations around it." The message was clear. Stay in your lane, keep your head down, and stop demonstrating knowledge that made people uncomfortable. Selma nodded and apologized profusely, but inside, she felt something she'd never experienced before: anger. She was angry at being dismissed, angry at watching the mission head toward failure, and most of all, angry at herself for lacking the courage to speak up when lives might depend on it. That night, she went home and ran her calculations one more time, confirming what she already knew. The Bergen mission was going to fail unless someone had the courage to challenge the plan. The question was whether that someone could possibly be a 23-year-old Norwegian girl who cried when people raised their voices and apologized for taking up space. In less than 48 hours, she was going to find out. The emergency alarm shattered the peaceful Norwegian morning at 6:47 a.m., its piercing wail echoing across the JTF Aegis facility like a mechanical scream. Selma dropped the espresso cup she'd been cleaning, watching it shatter on the floor as personnel sprinted past the mess hall windows toward the command center. "All senior staff to the Situation Room immediately," crackled the facility-wide announcement system. "This is not a drill. All senior staff to the Situation Room immediately." Selma stood frozen among the coffee shop debris, her heart hammering against her ribs as the facility transformed around her. Within minutes, the peaceful morning routine had become organized chaos. Elite operators jogged past carrying tactical gear while communications specialists shouted updates across corridors, through the mess hall's windows. She watched Lieutenant Commander Morrison's team loading equipment into vehicles with the practiced efficiency of professionals who'd done this hundreds of times before. But there was an urgency to their movements that suggested this wasn't a routine deployment. "Selma!" Captain Anderson's voice cut through the noise as he burst into the mess hall. His usual patronizing demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled tension. "We need coffee for the Situation Room. 20 cups, as strong as you can make them, and sandwiches if you can manage it quickly." "What's happening?" Selma asked, already moving toward the espresso machine with automatic efficiency. "Bergen," Anderson said curtly. The terrorist cell moved up their timeline. "They've taken hostages in the warehouse district, and they're threatening to detonate their explosives if anyone approaches. We've got maybe 6 hours before they follow through." Selma's hands moved independently of her racing mind, grinding coffee beans and heating milk while processing the implications of what she'd just heard. The mission that was supposed to happen in 48 hours was now happening in 6. All the careful planning, all the tactical preparations, everything was being compressed into an impossible timeline. More importantly, the building plans they'd been working from were definitely incomplete, and now there would be no time to correct the intelligence gaps. They were about to launch a rescue mission based on faulty information, and people were going to die because of it. As she prepared the coffee orders, fragments of urgent conversations drifted from the command center down the hall. Hostage count. Unknown. Double quotes. Structural assessment incomplete. Shape charges may not be sufficient for reinforced sections. That last phrase made Selma's blood turn cold. They were realizing in real time that their breach plan might not work. But instead of delaying to develop better intelligence, the pressure of the hostage situation was forcing them to proceed with an inadequate plan. She loaded the coffee cups onto a service cart and made her way toward the situation room, her mind racing through the calculations she'd run dozens of times in her apartment. The Bergen warehouse wasn't just reinforced with steel beams. It had been retrofitted specifically to resist explosive damage. The terrorist cell had chosen it precisely because it would be difficult to breach. The situation room was a controlled hurricane of activity when Selma entered. Large screens displayed satellite imagery, building blueprints, and real-time video feeds from Bergen. At the center of it all stood Lieutenant Commander Morrison, his voice calm but urgent as he coordinated multiple teams. Intelligence confirms at least 12 hostages, Morrison was saying to his assembled team. Terrorists are demanding the release of imprisoned associates and threatening to detonate explosives if approached. We have a 6-hour window before they claim they'll execute everyone inside. Selma served coffee with mechanical precision while her trained eye absorbed the tactical displays surrounding her. The building blueprints on the main screen were definitely the incomplete versions she'd seen before, missing the 2019 structural modifications that would make standard breach techniques ineffective. Breach Team Alpha will approach from the north entrance, Morrison continued, pointing to the diagrams. Shape charges here and here should create sufficient entry points for simultaneous insertion. Selma nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. The north entrance was exactly where the heaviest steel reinforcement had been installed. The shape charges Morrison was planning would barely scratch the surface, leaving his team exposed and vulnerable while failing to create any usable entry points. "Sir," she heard herself saying before she realized she'd spoken. The entire room turned to look at her, and she felt her face flush red with embarrassment and terror. Morrison's expression was patient, but slightly annoyed. "Yes, Selma? I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the sudden silence. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just ... The coffee service is complete, sir." "Thank you," Morrison replied, already turning back to his planning session. "That will be all." Selma nodded and began to retreat, but found herself frozen in place as she watched the tactical team continue planning what she knew would be a catastrophic failure. 12 hostages were about to die because no one would listen to the coffee girl's concerns about building specifications. As she finally forced herself to leave the situation room, Selma caught sight of Lieutenant Chen near the communications station. Chen looked up and met her eyes, and something passed between them. A moment of recognition that this mission was heading toward disaster. Back in the mess hall, Selma stood alone among the abandoned breakfast dishes and broken coffee cup fragments, listening to the sound of helicopters starting up outside. In less than 4 hours, those helicopters would carry Morrison's team toward a building that couldn't be breached the way they planned. The hostages would remain trapped, the terrorists would follow through on their threats, and 12 innocent people would die because she hadn't found the courage to speak up. She thought about her father, who'd spent his career in demolitions, and always told her that technical expertise meant nothing if you couldn't communicate it when lives depended on it. She thought about her physics professors who'd classified her thesis because they understood its real-world applications. And she thought about the promise she'd made to herself when she took this job, to be ready when her knowledge was needed, Selma walked to the supply closet and pulled out her personal bag, which she'd been keeping stocked with technical manuals and calculation tools for months. Inside was a detailed analysis of the Bergen warehouse that she'd completed weeks ago, including precise specifications for successful breach operations. The question was no longer whether she had the technical knowledge to save those hostages. The question was whether she had the emotional strength to overcome a lifetime of being dismissed and ignored. In 3 hours, she was going to find out exactly what she was made of. The final mission briefing began at 10:30 a.m. sharp, with Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Deployment in 2 hours," he announced to the assembled rescue teams. "Intelligence indicates the terrorists are becoming increasingly agitated. We cannot afford delays." Selma stood at the back of the Situation Room, officially present to manage coffee service, but actually studying every detail of the tactical presentation. The building schematics on the main display were still wrong, dangerously, catastrophically wrong. The planned breach points would hit solid steel reinforcement that the team didn't know existed. Her hands shook as she refilled coffee cups, the careful calculation she'd run dozens of times racing through her mind. The shaped charges Morrison was planning would not only fail to create entry points, but would likely cause structural damage that could collapse sections of the building onto the hostages below. "Selma," Captain Anderson's voice cut through her concentration, "the teams need to focus without distractions. Perhaps you could handle the coffee service from outside." It was a polite dismissal, but Selma recognized it for what it was, another reminder that her presence was tolerated, not valued. She nodded quietly and began collecting empty cups. But as she reached for Morrison's mug, she noticed his technical specifications spread across the table. The calculations were precise and professional, but they were based on standard concrete composition and assumed no significant structural modifications. In the margins of his notepad, Morrison had written 30% safety margin next to his explosive calculations, a responsible precaution that would prove meaningless when his charges encountered reinforced steel instead of standard concrete. "Excuse me, sir," Selma whispered, her voice barely audible over the tactical discussion surrounding them. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I noticed something about the building specifications that might be important." Morrison looked up from his planning, his expression shifting from focused concentration to mild irritation. "Selma, we're in the middle of final preparations here. Whatever housekeeping issues you've noticed can wait until after the mission." "It's not housekeeping, sir," Selma said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "It's about the structural modifications made to the warehouse in 2019. The building blueprints you're using don't show the steel reinforcement beams that were installed in the north and east walls. Your shaped charges won't be effective against those sections." The room fell silent for a moment, with every eye turning toward Selma. She felt her face burning with embarrassment, but forced herself to continue. "I have the updated building permits and structural assessments. The concrete composition is also different from standard specifications because of coastal salt resistance requirements. Your explosive calculations would need to be adjusted by approximately 30% to account for these factors." Captain Anderson stepped forward, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "Selma, this is completely inappropriate. You're a civilian food service employee, not a tactical consultant. These men are trained professionals who know what they're doing." "But sir," Selma pressed, her voice beginning to shake, "if the charges don't work, the hostages—" "Enough," Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of years of successful missions. "I appreciate your concern, Selma, but our intelligence team has thoroughly analyzed this target. We have structural engineers and demolitions experts who've been doing this work for decades. I can't modify a carefully planned operation based on suggestions from—" He paused, clearly searching for diplomatic language. "From the coffee girl," Selma finished quietly, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "From someone without relevant tactical experience," Morrison corrected, his tone not unkind but absolutely final. "Our plans are based on solid intelligence and proven methodologies. We can't second-guess that now." Sergeant First Class Williams, who'd been listening from across the room, stepped forward with barely concealed impatience. "With all due respect, sir, we're wasting time here, miss. Selma, whatever your concerns, this isn't the place for them. We have lives to save and a very narrow window to do it." "That's exactly why this matters," Selma said, her voice rising slightly as her emotional nature overcame her usual caution. "If the breach fails, those 12 hostages will die. I have detailed calculations that show exactly how to modify the charges for the actual building specifications. Please just look at the data." "The data," Captain Anderson said with exaggerated patience, "has been reviewed by qualified personnel. You're a sweet girl, Selma, but you're not qualified to evaluate tactical operations. Your job is to serve coffee, not to play military strategist." The words hit Selma like physical blows. Around her, she saw nodding heads and expressions that ranged from patronizing sympathy to outright annoyance. Even Lieutenant Chun, who'd always been kind to her, was looking away with obvious discomfort. "Now," Morrison said, returning to his planning materials, "we need to finalize our approach vectors. Time is running out." Selma stood frozen in the middle of the room, still holding her coffee service tray while the tactical discussion resumed around her as if she'd never spoken. The calculations that could save 12 lives were being dismissed without examination, and she was being relegated back to her assigned role of invisible service provider. She walked slowly toward the exit, her mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. In less than 2 hours, Morrison's team would deploy to Bergen with insufficient intelligence and inadequate equipment. The breach would fail, the rescue would become a siege, and the terrorists would follow through on their threats. Outside the situation room, Selma leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, fighting back tears of frustration and helplessness. She thought about the physics textbooks in her apartment, about her classified thesis on precision blast patterns, about all the preparation she'd done in case her expertise was ever needed. But expertise meant nothing if no one would listen. Knowledge was worthless if it couldn't be communicated. And all the technical skill in the world couldn't overcome the simple fact that she was just the emotional Norwegian girl who served coffee and cried when people spoke too loudly. The sound of helicopter engines starting up outside reminded her that time was running out. In 90 minutes, those helicopters would carry Morrison's team toward a building they couldn't properly breach, while 12 innocent people waited to die because their rescuers had incomplete information. Selma opened her eyes and stared at the situation room door. Inside, the world's most elite operatives were planning a mission based on faulty assumptions. Outside, she held the technical knowledge that could save everyone involved. Between those two realities lay the most important decision of her life: accept the limitations others had placed on her, or find the courage to act on what she knew was right. The helicopters grew louder, their rotors spinning up for departure. Selma checked her watch and realized she had perhaps 30 minutes before the point of no return. 30 minutes to find a way to make someone listen, or to live with the consequences of staying silent. She straightened her shoulders and began walking toward her personal locker, where she kept the detailed Bergen warehouse analysis that no one wanted to see. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons, but with the courage to speak truth to power, even when that power preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable facts. Selma's hands trembled as she pulled the encrypted flash drive from her personal locker, knowing that what she was about to do would either save 12 lives or end her career, possibly both. The detailed Bergen warehouse analysis she'd compiled over weeks of secret research contained everything Morrison's team needed to know, but getting them to look at it would require crossing lines she'd never dared approach before. The helicopter engines outside were growing louder. Their rhythmic, thumping a countdown to disaster. Through the facility windows, she could see Morrison's team conducting final equipment checks, their movements precise and professional as they prepared for a mission based on incomplete intelligence. Selma took a deep breath and walked back toward the situation room where the final departure briefing was underway. But instead of entering through the main door, she circled around to the communications center, where Lieutenant Chen was monitoring intelligence feeds from Bergen. "Lieutenant Chen," Selma said quietly, approaching the bank of monitors where Chen was working. "I need to show you something urgently." Chen looked up with surprise and mild concern. "Selma, shouldn't you be handling lunch preparations?" "The teams deploy in 45 minutes, I know," Selma interrupted, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "That's why this can't wait. The breach plan is going to fail. People are going to die if someone doesn't look at the real building." "Specifications." Something in Selma's tone made Chun pause her other activities. "What are you talking about?" Selma plugged her flash drive into Chun's computer terminal and pulled up the detailed architectural analysis she'd prepared. The warehouse was extensively modified in 2019. Steel reinforcement beams, salt-resistant concrete, additional structural supports, none of which appear in the intelligence package Morrison's team is using. Chun's eyes widened as she scrolled through Selma's documentation. The analysis was incredibly thorough, complete with cross-referenced building permits, material specifications, and precise calculations for effective breach operations. "Selma, this is doctoral-level engineering analysis," Chun said with amazement. "Where did you get this? How do you even know how to calculate shape-charge effectiveness ratios?" "My degree is in applied physics with a specialization in controlled demolitions," Selma replied, watching Chun's expression shift from surprise to shock. "My thesis was on precision blast patterns in urban environments. The Norwegian government classified it because of the tactical applications." Chun stared at her for a long moment, processing this revelation. "You have a PhD in explosives engineering, and you're working as a coffee server?" "I wanted to be near real applications of my research," Selma explained. "But that's not important now. What's important is that Morrison's shaped charges will be approximately 40% less effective than his calculations predict. The north wall breach point he's planning will hit solid steel reinforcement. The charges won't penetrate, and the blast reflection could injure his team." Chun was already reaching for her radio. "I need to get this to Morrison immediately." "I tried," Selma said, her voice heavy with frustration. 20 minutes ago. He dismissed it without looking at the data. Captain Anderson said I should stick to serving coffee and leave tactical planning to the professionals." "This is insane," Chun muttered, scrolling through more of Selma's calculations. "This analysis is better than anything our intelligence team produced. How long have you been working on this?" 8 months, Selma admitted. "I've been studying every building in the operational area, calculating breach scenarios, analyzing structural vulnerabilities. I wanted to be ready if my expertise was ever needed." Shen was quiet for a moment, studying the data with the trained eye of a military intelligence analyst. "Selma, if you're right about this and your calculations suggest you are, then Morrison's team is heading into a catastrophic failure. The breach won't work, the hostages will remain trapped, and the terrorists will follow through on their execution threats." "I know," Selma whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "That's why I had to try again. Even though I know no one wants to listen to the emotional coffee girl who doesn't know her place." Shun looked at her with a mixture of respect and amazement. "You're not a coffee girl, Selma. You're a demolitions expert who happens to serve coffee. There's a massive difference." The sound of helicopter rotors reached a crescendo outside, indicating that departure preparations were nearly complete. Chun made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her radio and keyed the emergency frequency. Situation room. This is Chun in communications. I have critical intelligence regarding the Bergen warehouse structure that requires immediate review before deployment. Morrison's voice crackled back immediately. Chun, we're in final departure sequence. What kind of intelligence? Sir, I have detailed architectural analysis showing significant structural modifications that aren't reflected in our current intelligence package. The planned breach points may not be viable. There was a pause, then Morrison's voice returned, with barely controlled frustration. Chun, we've been through this. Our intelligence team has thoroughly analyzed the target building. We can't delay departure based on last-minute concerns. Chun looked at Selma, who nodded with determined resolve. Sir, the analysis comes from someone with a doctoral degree in applied physics and controlled demolitions. The calculations show that current shaped charge specifications will be insufficient for the actual building composition and reinforcement. Another pause, longer this time. What source are you referring to, Chun? Chun took a deep breath. Specialist Selma Bakke, sir. Her academic background is in precision demolitions engineering, and she's identified critical flaws in our current breach plan. The radio silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Finally, Morrison's voice returned, tight with disbelief. Are you telling me that our coffee service employee claims to have explosives expertise that contradicts our professional tactical assessment? I'm telling you that Dr. Bakke has identified structural modifications that could cause mission failure and loss of life, Chun replied firmly, and that her analysis is the most thorough I've seen. Selma felt her heart stop. Chun had just called her Dr. Bakke over an open radio channel, revealing credentials that she'd been hiding for 8 months. There was no going back now. Either her expertise would be recognized, or she'd be dismissed as a fraud in front of the entire Joint Task Force. The next 30 seconds would determine whether 12 hostages lived or died, and whether a 23-year-old Norwegian physicist would finally be taken seriously by the people she'd been quietly serving coffee to while secretly preparing to save their lives. Chun, bring Dr. Bakke to the situation room immediately. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with a tone that suggested he was either about to validate Selma's expertise or expose her as a fraud in front of the entire Joint Task Force. And bring her analysis with you. Selma felt her legs go weak as the full implications hit her. In less than 2 minutes, she would be standing in front of the world's most elite military operatives, defending calculations that contradicted their professional assessment while 12 lives hung in the balance. Her emotional nature, which had been a liability for 8 months, now threatened to overwhelm her at the moment when clarity was most crucial. Breathe, Lieutenant Chun said quietly as they walked toward the situation room. You know this material better than anyone in that room. Trust your expertise. The situation room fell silent when Selma entered carrying her laptop and technical files. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stood at the center, his expression unreadable as he studied the woman who'd been serving his coffee for 8 months while apparently hiding a PhD in demolitions engineering. Dr. Bakke, Morrison said, his tone carefully neutral. Lieutenant Chun tells me you have concerns about our breach plan. You have approximately 3 minutes to present your analysis before we deploy. Selma's hands shook as she connected her laptop to the main display system, replacing the tactical maps with her detailed architectural analysis of the Bergen warehouse. The room remained deadly quiet as her calculations filled the screen. Complex equations, 3D structural models, and blast pattern simulations that looked more like classified military research than something produced by a coffee server. The warehouse underwent extensive structural modifications in 2019. Selma began, her voice barely above a whisper, but growing stronger as she focused on the technical details. Steel reinforcement beams were installed in the north and east walls, specifically to resist explosive damage. The building permits are publicly available through Bergen's municipal database. She highlighted sections of the 3D model showing the Steel framework hidden within the concrete walls. Your planned breach points here and here will impact solid steel supports. The shaped charges you're planning to use will be approximately 40% less effective than your calculations predict. Captain Anderson stepped forward with obvious skepticism. Even if what you're saying is accurate, our demolitions team consists of experts with decades of field experience. Are you suggesting they've made fundamental errors in their assessment? I'm suggesting they didn't have complete information, Selma replied, pulling up comparative blast simulations. The concrete composition is also different from standard specifications. Bergen's coastal location requires salt-resistant additives that significantly alter explosive effectiveness. Your charges are calculated for standard Portland cement. But this building uses a polymer-modified mix that's 30% more resistant to concussive force. The room erupted in murmurs as the implications became clear. Sergeant Williams leaned over to examine the technical specifications more closely, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. "Dr. Bakke," Morrison said, his voice carrying new respect, "assuming your analysis is correct, what modifications would you recommend to our breach plan?" Selma felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized they were actually listening to her. She pulled up a new set of calculations that she'd run dozens of times in preparation for exactly this moment. You need linear-shaped charges instead of circular ones for the steel reinforcement, deployed at precisely these angles to work between the support beams rather than against them. The concrete requires a 35% increase in explosive composition. But the charges need to be positioned lower on the wall to account for the foundation modifications. She clicked through detailed diagrams showing optimal placement positions. More importantly, the north wall approach won't work at all. The steel reinforcement is too dense. You need to approach from the southwest corner, where the original construction meets the modified sections. That's your weakness point. Morrison studied the analysis with the intensity of someone whose decisions determined whether people lived or died. "How certain are you about these calculations, Dr. Bakke?" "Completely certain about the structural analysis," Selma replied. "The building permits and material specifications are documented facts. The blast calculations are based on proven physics principles that I've verified through multiple simulation models. The helicopter engines outside were still running, their sound a constant reminder that time was disappearing." Morrison looked at his team, then back at Selma's analysis, clearly weighing the risks of proceeding with the original plan against the risks of making last-minute modifications based on advice from someone they'd never taken seriously before. "The problem," said Master Sergeant Rodriguez, "is that we don't have the equipment Dr. Bakke is recommending. Our loadout is based on the original assessment. Linear-shaped charges, polymer-cutting compounds, precision placement equipment. We'd need at least 6 hours to acquire and configure the proper materials." 6 hours we don't have, Williams added grimly. "The terrorists have made it clear that any delay will result in immediate execution of hostages." Selma felt her heart sink as she realized that being right wasn't enough. Even with accurate intelligence and proper calculations, the mission was constrained by equipment limitations and time pressure. Her expertise could identify the problem, but couldn't overcome the logistical realities of military operations. "Unless," Morrison said slowly, his eyes fixed on Selma with sudden intensity, "Dr. Bakke knows of alternative approaches that work with our current equipment loadout." Every eye in the room turned toward Selma, and she felt the full weight of 12 lives pressing down on her shoulders. This was the moment she'd been unconsciously preparing for during 8 months of secret study, not just to identify problems, but to solve them under impossible constraints. She took a deep breath and began pulling up a new set of calculations, ones that she'd hoped never to need. "There's one approach that could work," she said quietly, "but it's extremely dangerous, requires perfect timing, and depends on someone being inside the building to coordinate the breach from within." The room fell silent as the implications of what she was suggesting became clear. Morrison leaned forward with sharp attention. "Explain." Selma's fingers moved across her keyboard, bringing up a complex sequence of blast patterns and timing charts. "If someone could get inside the building and place charges at the precise weak points I've identified, while your team coordinates external breaches at these secondary locations, the combined blast pattern would create a controlled structural failure that opens multiple entry points simultaneously." "Someone inside the building," Captain Anderson repeated slowly, "with armed terrorists and 12 hostages. That's not a rescue plan. That's a suicide mission." Selma looked up from her calculations and met Morrison's eyes with surprising steadiness. Not if that someone understood the blast patterns well enough to position themselves in the safe zones during detonation. And not if they were small enough to move through the building's maintenance systems undetected. The silence that followed was electric with possibility and terror. Morrison studied Selma's analysis, then looked at her with the expression of someone reassessing everything he thought he knew about the quiet Norwegian girl who'd been serving his coffee while secretly preparing to risk her life for people she'd never met. "Dr. Bakke," he said quietly, "are you volunteering for an infiltration mission?" Lieutenant Commander Morrison's question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and Selma felt every eye in the room focused on her with an intensity that made her previous invisibility seem like a distant memory. The quiet coffee server, who apologized for existing, was being asked to infiltrate a terrorist-controlled building and coordinate a precision demolition that could save 12 lives or kill everyone involved. "Yes, sir," Selma heard herself saying, her voice steadier than she'd ever managed during 8 months of being dismissed and ignored. "I volunteer for the infiltration mission." The room erupted in immediate protests. Captain Anderson stepped forward with alarm written across his face. "Absolutely not. Dr. Bakke, you have no tactical training, no field experience, and no preparation for this kind of operation. This is exactly the kind of emotional decision-making that, with respect—" "Captain," Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through the objections like a blade, "Dr. Bakke is the only person in this room who understands the structural vulnerabilities well enough to place charges with the precision this plan requires. And she's right about the size advantage. Our smallest operative is still too large to navigate the building's maintenance systems undetected." Sergeant Williams was studying Selma's infiltration plan on the main display, his expression shifting from skepticism to grudging admiration. "The approach route she's mapped through the ventilation system is actually brilliant. But sir, the physical demands alone, crawling through confined spaces while carrying demolition equipment, then placing charges under extreme time pressure." "I've been preparing for this," Selma said quietly, causing another moment of stunned silence in the room. "Not specifically this mission, but for the possibility that my expertise might be needed in field conditions. I've maintained physical conditioning standards, studied tactical movement techniques, and practiced working with demolition equipment under stress." Lieutenant Chun, who had been quietly observing from the communication station, stepped forward. "Dr. Bakke's analysis has been correct about everything so far. If she says she can execute this infiltration, I think we have to consider it seriously." Morrison walked to the main display and studied Selma's proposed route through the building's infrastructure. The plan was incredibly detailed, showing precise entry points, movement paths that avoided areas where terrorists were likely to be positioned, and optimal locations for charge placement that would create the controlled structural failure needed for simultaneous breach operations. "Dr. Bakke," Morrison said, his tone carrying new respect that Selma had never heard directed toward her before, "walk me through the timeline. From infiltration to coordinate breach, how long do you need?" Selma pulled up a detailed operational sequence on her laptop. "Infiltration through the maintenance access should take approximately 20 minutes. Charge placement at the 6 critical points will require another 15 minutes. That gives your external teams 35 minutes to position for coordinated breach. And you're certain about the safe zones during detonation? Williams asked, clearly wrestling with the implications of sending a civilian into a terrorist-controlled building. Completely certain, Selma replied, highlighting areas on the structural diagram. The blast patterns will create a controlled collapse of specific wall sections while leaving these zones structurally intact. The physics are straightforward. It's the timing and placement that require precision. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was examining the equipment list Selma had specified for the mission. Dr. Bakke, some of this gear is highly specialized. The polymer cutting charges, the remote detonation systems, you'll need to configure and deploy. Equipment that most demolition experts train with for months before using operationally. I've been training with similar equipment for 2 years, Selma said, then paused as she realized how that sounded. I mean, I acquired training materials and practiced with them in controlled environments. I wanted to understand real-world applications of my theoretical knowledge. Captain Anderson shook his head with disbelief. Are you telling me you've been conducting unauthorized demolition training while working as our coffee server? I've been preparing to serve my country in whatever capacity my expertise might be needed, Selma replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Whether that was analyzing intelligence reports or, apparently, infiltrating terrorist positions to save hostage lives. Morrison studied her for a long moment, and Selma could see him weighing dozens of factors: mission success probability, personnel safety, operational protocols, and the unprecedented situation of discovering that their logistics support staff included a demolitions expert who'd been hiding in plain sight for 8 months. The helicopter timeline is our biggest constraint, Morrison said finally. We have a 30-minute flight to Bergen, which gives us exactly enough time to brief Dr. Bakke on tactical protocols and configure her equipment load, if we're going. To do this, we need to decide now. The silence that followed felt like the moment before an explosion. Selma realized that everything in her life had been building toward this instant: her hidden education, her secret preparations, her months of being underestimated and overlooked. Now the people who dismissed her as too emotional and too small were considering trusting her with the most dangerous part of the most critical mission they'd ever undertaken. Sir, she said quietly, I know this is unprecedented. I know you have every reason to doubt whether someone like me can handle field operations. But I also know that my approach gives those hostages the best chance of survival, and I'm the only person here who can execute it properly. Morrison looked around the room at his team members, reading their expressions and gauging their confidence in this impossible plan. Finally, he turned back to Selma with the expression of someone making a decision that would either save lives or haunt him forever. Dr. Bakke, he said formally, you are hereby attached to Joint Task Force Aegis as a technical specialist for this mission. Your primary objective is infiltration and precision charge placement to enable coordinated breach operations. Are you prepared to accept this assignment? Selma felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but this time they weren't from emotional overwhelm or frustration. They were from the recognition that after 8 months of being invisible, she was finally being seen for who she really was, not the emotional coffee girl, but the demolitions expert who'd been preparing for exactly this moment. Yes, sir, she said, her voice clear and strong. I accept the assignment. Morrison nodded and turned to his team. Equipment specialist, configure Dr. Bakke's gear load. Communications, establish infiltration frequencies. Navigation, verify the approach route through current reconnaissance data. We deploy in 15 minutes. As the room exploded into activity around her, Selma stood at the center of organized chaos, watching elite operatives prepare equipment for someone they'd been dismissing as inadequate just 30 minutes earlier. The transformation was surreal, from invisible support staff to critical mission. Specialist in the span of a single conversation. But the real transformation wasn't in how others saw her. It was in how she saw herself. For the first time in 8 months, Selma Bakke felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Bergen's industrial district spread below them like a tactical puzzle waiting to be solved. Selma sat strapped into the aircraft's cargo area, wearing tactical gear that felt surprisingly natural despite being designed for operators twice her size. The specialized demolition equipment, secured to her harness, represented months of theoretical preparation suddenly becoming deadly reality. "Lieutenant," Commander Morrison's voice crackled through her headset as they approached the target building. "Dr. Bakke, final systems check. Confirm equipment status and communication links." Selma ran through her gear methodically, her training taking over despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Polymer cutting charges secured and armed. "Remote. Detonation system active and synchronized with your command frequency. Structural analysis tablet operational. Communication link clear and strong." Through the helicopter's windows, she could see the warehouse that had dominated her calculations for weeks. From above, the building looked deceptively simple, a converted industrial structure that gave no hint of the steel reinforcement and modified concrete that made it nearly impregnable to conventional breach techniques. Visual confirmation of terrorist positions came the voice of the reconnaissance team already on site. At least 4 guards visible on the perimeter, probably more inside. Hostages appear to be held in the central section of the building, away from the planned breach points. Selma studied the real-time intelligence feeds on her tablet, comparing them to her architectural analysis. Everything matched her predictions. The terrorists had chosen their positions to maximize the difficulty of any rescue attempt, but they'd also positioned themselves exactly where her structural calculations suggested they would. "Dr. Bakke," Morrison said as the helicopter began its approach to the drop zone, "once you're inside that building, you'll be operating independently with no backup. Are you certain about the infiltration route?" "Yes, sir," Selma replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The maintenance access leads directly to the building's interior structure. The terrorists won't expect anyone to approach through the ventilation system because it requires specialized knowledge of the building modifications." The helicopter touched down 3 blocks from the target, far enough away to avoid detection, but close enough for rapid deployment once the breach began. As Selma prepared to disembark, she caught sight of Captain Anderson's expression, a mixture of concern and something that might have been respect. "Dr. Bakke," Anderson said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I spent 8 months seeing you as someone who needed protection rather than someone capable of providing it. Don't prove me wrong about your abilities, but don't prove me right about the dangers either." Selma nodded, understanding the complicated sentiment behind his words. "I'll bring everyone home, Captain. That's what the calculations show, and that's what I intend to deliver." The infiltration route began in an alley behind the warehouse, where Selma located the maintenance access exactly where the building plans indicated it would be. The steel grate covering the entrance had been secured with a standard lock that yielded quickly to her bypass tools, another skill she'd acquired during her secret preparation. The ventilation system was smaller than she'd anticipated, requiring her to crawl through spaces barely 18 inches high while dragging her equipment behind her. But her small size, which had been dismissed as a liability for 8 months, was now the critical advantage that made the entire mission possible. "Infiltration team leader, this is Dr. Bakke," she whispered into her throat microphone as she navigated through the building's hidden infrastructure. "I'm inside the structure and approaching the first charge placement point. No contact with hostile forces." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Copy, Dr. Bakke. External teams are in position and standing by for your signal. Take your time and maintain stealth." The first charge placement point was located behind a structural support beam that the terrorists couldn't see, But that would be critical for the controlled collapse Selma had designed. Working in near-total darkness, she attached the polymer cutting. Charged with the precision her months of practice had developed, each charge had to be positioned within millimeters of the optimal location, too high or too low, too far left or right, and the blast pattern would fail to create the coordinated structural failure that would open multiple breach points simultaneously while protecting the hostages in the central area. First charge placed and armed, Selma reported as she moved toward the second location. Structural analysis confirms optimal positioning. Proceeding to charge point 2. The second location required her to crawl through a section of the ventilation system that ran directly above the room where terrorists were holding the hostages. Through the metal grating, she could see 12 civilians sitting against a wall with their hands bound, while 2 armed men paced nearby with automatic weapons. Selma forced herself to focus on the technical requirements rather than the emotional impact of seeing the people she was risking her life to save. The second charge went into position with the same precision as the first, its placement calculated to create a specific blast vector that would neutralize the wall section without endangering anyone in the adjacent room. Second charge placed. And armed, she whispered. Visual confirmation of hostage positions. They're exactly where our intelligence predicted, in the safest zone during the planned detonation sequence. Outstanding work, Dr. Bakke, Morrison replied. Continue to charge point 3. External teams report ready for coordinated breach on your signal. The third and fourth charge placements went smoothly, but the fifth location presented an unexpected challenge. The access route that had looked clear on the building plans was partially blocked by equipment that the terrorists had moved to create defensive positions. Selma studied the obstruction through her night vision scope, calculating alternative approaches that would still allow optimal charge placement. The solution required her to exit the ventilation system temporarily and move through an open area where detection was possible. Infiltration team leader, I have a complication at charge point 5, she reported. Hostile equipment is blocking the planned access route. I need to modify my approach, which will increase exposure risk, but maintain mission effectiveness. Dr. Bakke, if the risk is too high, we can abort and find alternative approaches, Morrison replied, but Selma could hear the tension in his voice. They all knew that alternative approaches meant waiting for equipment they didn't have in time. They couldn't afford. Negative, sir, Selma whispered as she prepared to leave the safety of the ventilation system. The mission parameters remain within acceptable limits. I'm proceeding with charge placement. Moving through the open area required every stealth technique she'd studied and practiced. Her small size allowed her to use shadows and obstacles that wouldn't have concealed larger operatives, and her intimate knowledge of the building's layout let her avoid areas where terrorists were likely to be watching. The fifth charge went into position without detection, but as Selma moved toward the final placement point, she heard voices approaching her location. 2 terrorists were conducting a security sweep, moving directly toward the area where she needed to complete her mission. Selma pressed herself against a structural support beam and controlled her breathing, knowing that the next 60 seconds would determine whether 12 hostages lived or died, and whether the girl who'd been dismissed as too emotional for real work would prove that courage wasn't measured by size or gender, but by the willingness to risk everything when lives depended on it. The footsteps of the approaching terrorists echoed through the warehouse structure like a countdown to disaster. Selma pressed herself against the cold steel support beam, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away her position. The final charge placement point was just 3 meters away, but those 3 meters might as well have been 3 kilometers with armed hostiles. Moving directly toward her location, through her night vision scope, she watched 2 terrorists conducting their security sweep with professional efficiency. They were checking areas that other guards might have missed, and their route would bring them directly past the structural point, where she needed to place the last explosive charge. "Dr. Bakke, report status," Morrison's voice whispered through her earpiece. "External teams are holding position pending your completion signal." Selma keyed her throat microphone with the barest touch, transmitting a double click that indicated she was in position but unable to speak. The terrorists were now close enough that she could hear their conversation in Norwegian, a language they probably assumed no one else in the building understood. "The police are getting nervous," one was saying to the other. "They've been too quiet for too long. Something is happening." "Let them try something," the second terrorist replied. "This building is a fortress. No one can get through those walls with conventional weapons." Selma almost smiled at the irony. They were absolutely right about conventional weapons, which was exactly why her unconventional approach was going to work. But first, she had to place the final charge without being detected by two armed men, who were now less than 2 meters from her position. The terrorists paused directly in front of the structural support where Selma was hidden, and she could see them clearly through the metal framework. One was checking his watch while the other scanned the area with a flashlight that passed within inches of her concealed position. Then she noticed something that made her breath catch. The terrorist with the flashlight was standing directly beside the optimal placement point for her final charge. If she could somehow distract them for just 30 seconds, she could complete the mission while they were still close enough to be neutralized by the blast pattern she'd designed. Selma reached into her equipment pack and found a small piece of metal debris, a bolt that had come loose from her gear during the crawl through the ventilation system. With careful precision, she flicked it across the room, where it landed with a small metallic clatter near the opposite wall. Both terrorists immediately turned toward the sound, raising their weapons and moving to investigate. The moment their backs were turned, Selma slipped from her hiding place and attached the final charge to the exact position her calculations required. "Final charge placed and armed," she whispered into her microphone as she retreated back to the safety of the structural framework. "All 6 charges are positioned and synchronized. Ready for coordinated detonation on your command." "Outstanding work, Dr. Bakke." Morrison's voice carried genuine admiration despite the tactical urgency. "Move to your designated safe zone. Coordinated breach commences in 60 seconds. Selma moved quickly through the building structure toward the location she'd calculated would be safest during the controlled demolition. Her analysis showed that the blast pattern would create multiple entry points while leaving a triangular section near the hostages completely intact, a zone where the structural forces would actually strengthen rather than weaken the buildings. Framework. As she reached her safe position, Selma could hear activity outside that indicated Morrison's external teams were moving into their final breach positions. Everything was proceeding exactly as her calculations had predicted, but the next 30 seconds would determine whether theoretical physics translated successfully into real-world results. "All external teams report ready," Morrison announced through the communications network. "Dr. Bakke, confirm you are in safe zone and ready for detonation sequence." "Confirmed," Selma replied, checking her position one final time against her structural analysis. "I am in the designated safe zone. All charges are armed and synchronized. Ready for coordinated detonation." "Understood. Detonation sequence commencing in 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Execute." The explosion was unlike anything Selma had ever experienced, even in her controlled laboratory tests. 6 precisely placed charges detonated simultaneously, creating a complex pattern of structural failure that transformed solid walls into carefully designed entry points. The sound was deafening, but the building responded exactly as her calculations had predicted. Instead of random destruction, the blast created 3 distinct breaches in the north, east, and south walls while leaving the central structure intact. Dust and debris filled the air, but the hostage area remained completely secure. protected by the physics principles that Selma had spent years studying and months applying to this specific scenario. Breach successful. Morrison's voice cut through the settling dust. All entry points are viable. Teams Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, commence insertion. Dr. Bakke, report status. I'm secure and uninjured, Selma replied, watching through the cleared air as Morrison's teams poured through the opening she'd created. Structural analysis confirms all critical support areas remain intact. The building is stable for continued operations. The terrorist neutralization took less than 3 minutes. Morrison's teams moved with coordinated precision through the entry points that Selma's explosives had created, overwhelming the hostile forces before they could react to the sudden appearance of multiple breach points. The hostages were secured, without a single casualty, their location having been protected by the exact blast pattern Selma had designed. All hostiles neutralized, came the report from Team Alpha. 12 hostages secured, all in good condition. Building is clear and safe for extraction. As Selma made her way out of the warehouse structure, she emerged to find the entire Joint Task Force Aegis leadership waiting for her. Morrison stood at the center of the group, his expression showing a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal amazement. Dr. Bakke, he said as she approached, your infiltration and demolition work was flawless. Every calculation was precise, every charge placement was optimal, and every aspect of the mission proceeded exactly as you predicted it would. Captain Anderson stepped forward, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by genuine respect. Dr. Bakke, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition that your expertise saved 12 lives today, and that my failure to recognize your capabilities earlier could have cost lives in other situations. The gathered operatives, the same men who had dismissed her as too emotional and too small for real military work, were looking at her with expressions she'd never seen before. Not patronizing tolerance or benevolent condescension, but professional. Respect earned through demonstrated competence under the most extreme conditions imaginable. What happens now? Selma asked, still processing the transformation from coffee server to mission specialist to recognized expert in the span of a single day. Morrison smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she'd ever seen from him. Now, Dr. Bakke, we discuss your permanent assignment to our technical operations team. It turns out that having a demolitions expert who's been studying our operational area for 8 months is exactly what this joint task force needs. As the rescue helicopters lifted the freed hostages toward medical care, Selma stood among the elite operatives who had finally seen past her quiet demeanor and emotional nature to recognize the expertise she'd been carrying all along. The girl who had been deemed too small for real work had just executed the most technically challenging mission any of them had ever witnessed. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she was already calculating the structural vulnerabilities of the next building that might need her unique combination of theoretical knowledge and practical courage. 1 year after the Bergen warehouse mission, Selma stood before an auditorium filled with military personnel from 12 nations, delivering a lecture that would have been unimaginable during her coffee-serving days. The presentation title read, Unconventional Expertise, Identifying and Leveraging Hidden Capabilities in Military Organizations. The most dangerous assumption in any organization, Selma told her audience, her voice carrying the confidence that came from having saved lives while proving conventional wisdom wrong, is that you already know what everyone is capable of. Potential exists in places you're not looking, and expertise often hides behind roles that seem unrelated to critical missions. In the front row sat Lieutenant Commander Morrison, now promoted to Colonel and serving as Director of the International Technical Operations Program that had grown from Selma's breakthrough methods. Beside him, Captain Anderson, recently elevated to Major, was taking notes with the same intensity he'd once applied to dismissing her suggestions, The transformation had extended far beyond individual career changes. Joint Task Force Aegis had become a model for military innovation, with organizations worldwide sending personnel to study their approaches to unconventional problem-solving and human resource development. Dr. Bakke, came a question from a German GSG-9 officer in the audience. Your infiltration techniques have been adopted by special operations units across Europe, but the broader lesson seems to be about challenging assumptions. How do organizations systematically identify expertise they're not utilizing? Selma clicked to a slide showing the assessment protocols that had been developed from her case study. Start by assuming that everyone has capabilities you haven't discovered yet. Ask better questions during personnel evaluations. Look at education, training, and interests that extend beyond current job requirements. Most importantly, create environments where people feel safe revealing expertise that doesn't match their assigned roles. The protocols had already led to remarkable discoveries. Military bases were finding that support staff included former engineers, linguists, medical professionals, and technical specialists who'd been relegated to basic tasks because their additional qualifications hadn't been recognized or utilized. After her presentation, Selma was approached by a young corporal from the U.S. Army who seemed nervous about speaking with someone of her reputation. Dr. Bakke, I wanted to thank you for sharing your story. I have a degree in computer science, but I've been working in vehicle maintenance because that's where they assigned me. Your example gave me the courage to request evaluation for cybersecurity positions. That's exactly what should happen, Selma replied warmly. Your technical skills shouldn't be wasted just because they don't match your current assignment. Organizations benefit when everyone can contribute their best capabilities. These conversations have become routine for Selma, but they never lost their significance. Each person who found the courage to reveal hidden expertise represented another victory against the assumption that current roles define ultimate potential. Later that afternoon, Selma visited the Joint Task Force Aegis mess hall, where a new coffee service employee was working with the same quiet efficiency she had demonstrated a year earlier. But unlike her experience, this employee, a former structural engineer from Romania, had been immediately enrolled in technical consultation programs after revealing her background during the enhanced assessment process. Dr. Bakke called. Anna Peterson, now serving as Director of Personnel Development, I wanted to show you the latest statistics from our expanded evaluation program. We've identified advanced expertise in 40% of personnel who were previously considered basic support staff. The numbers were staggering but not surprising to Selma. Military organizations, like most institutions, had been systematically underutilizing their human resources by making assumptions about what people could contribute based on narrow assessments of their current performance. The Bergen mission was just the beginning, Selma reflected. Every organization probably has people whose potential could transform operations if it were properly recognized and developed. That evening, Selma received a video call from her sister in Texas, who had watched news coverage of the international conference with amazement. I still can't believe my little sister, who used to cry when Dad raised his voice, is now teaching military organizations how to think differently about expertise and capability. I still cry when people are unkind, Selma replied with a smile. But I learned there's a difference between emotional sensitivity and professional competence. Some of our greatest strengths can look like weaknesses if people don't understand them properly. The conversation reminded her of the letter she'd written before the unauthorized rescue mission, the one she'd prepared in case she didn't survive the infiltration. In it, she'd tried to explain why proving yourself sometimes meant defying the people who claim to know your limitations. Now, a year later, she understood that the real victory wasn't just in saving 12 lives or gaining professional recognition. It was in changing the conversation about how organizations evaluate potential and what assumptions they make about who can contribute to critical missions. As she prepared for sleep in her upgraded quarters, a far cry from the small apartment, where she'd secretly studied demolitions manuals, Selma reflected on the extraordinary journey from invisible coffee server to internationally recognized expert. The transformation had required technical expertise, physical courage, and emotional resilience. But most importantly, it had required the determination to exceed expectations rather than accept limitations. The next morning would bring new challenges. A complex operation in Eastern Europe that would test every skill she developed and several she was still learning. But Selma approached it with confidence born from the knowledge that being underestimated had become her greatest tactical advantage. Somewhere in military bases around the world, other people were quietly preparing for moments when their hidden expertise might be needed. Inspired by the example of a Norwegian physicist who'd proven that the most important qualifications often exist in the most unexpected places, the girl who'd been just making coffee had become the woman who taught others that no one is just anything. Everyone has potential waiting for the right crisis to reveal it and the right leadership to recognize its value. And sometimes, the most explosive revelations come not from shaped charges and precision demolitions, but from the courage to show the world exactly what you're capable of accomplishing when someone finally gives you the chance to prove it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.